Live. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. We're really excited because today it's a little bit of all three of those things, which is really great. Right now, I want to take the chance to introduce our six classes joining us from across North America. So we've got Miss Langer's grade 3-4s in Cobourg, Ontario. Hi, guys. Hi. Awesome. We've got Mr. Fisher's grade 7s in Canada, Ontario. Hi, guys. Hey, nice couch. I didn't have any couches in my school when I was a kid. You guys are lucky. All right, we've got Miss Gray's grade 5-6s in Glen in Pennsylvania. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hey, welcome in. We've got Miss Salazar's grade 9s in Laredo, Texas, having some tech difficulties, but let's see if we've got them anyway. Hi, guys. Maybe kind of sort of. Okay, I'll send them the YouTube link just to make sure they're good. We've got Mr. Douglas's grade 11 and 12s in Peterborough, Ontario. Hi, guys. Hey, welcome in. And last but not least, we've got Miss Winning's 5-6s in Barrie, Ontario. Hi, guys. Hey, awesome. All right. Of course, the reason you guys are all joining us today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, by Dr. Shelby Riskin. So she is an assistant professor and ecologist at the University of Toronto. And what she works on is understanding what happens when we take wild ecosystems and turn them into places that humans use, like farms and cities and more. And today, specifically, she's going to focus on her work in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, one of the most amazing and incredible landscapes in the world, and one that many of you may have heard about through the news this year with all the fires that happened there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Riskin, and take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm so excited and honored that you all showed up to listen to what I have to say today. Thank you. As Jesse said, I am an ecologist and I work in the Amazon in Brazil, and I work on what happens when you convert rainforest to agriculture, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of that today. And try to contextualize why all of these fires this year and why patterns of deforestation in the Amazon matter in general. So let me get my presentation up here and I'll see your faces later.
You're good.
Okay, we're good. Great. Okay, so being a field ecologist has allowed me to go to parts of the world that I would never have otherwise had the chance to visit or have the chance to visit. And I've had the opportunity to work on these big global questions and problems that I really care deeply about. And along the way, I've had some adventures, some amazing, some scary. I'll try to tell you about a few. So this is a picture from a field site where I work in Brazil, and it doesn't look too much like the tropical rainforest anymore. This area has been cleared of trees and plants, or deforested, for growing crops. So it's being turned into a farm field. And some of the questions I ask in my research are about what happens after this deforestation to the environment. So, for example, is the water in streams and lakes in these farm fields as clean as the water in streams and lakes in the tropical rainforest itself? Or is there the same amount of water in those lakes and streams? And what happens to the soils when you can convert these soils to agriculture? Do plants grow as well? Does it support the same kind of productivity? And it may seem a little bit boring to ask questions about water and dirt in a place that is filled with jaguars and sloths and venomous snakes, but much of the amazing life in the Amazon wouldn't and won't be able to survive without an ecosystem that functions to support it, without clean water or the appropriate climate. So a lot of people talk about tropical forests as being the lungs of the world, and that analogy is not quite right. That doesn't mean that tropical forests aren't essential, but a better analogy might be to think about them as the world's air conditioner. And I won't have time to talk about all the ways that this is true today, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how water flows through these ecosystems and how it serves to cool and maintain this tropical forest. So here's an overview of the forest canopy, and the Amazon is the largest remaining rainforest in the world. It holds 1/10 of all identified species on Earth, and it covers an area as big as all Canadian provinces and territories added together, if you exclude Quebec, or it's 12 times the area of the US state of Texas. In other words, it is huge, and it is home to a huge number of all of the organisms, the plants, the animals, the fungi, the microbes that call Earth home. So to drive this home, in a small area, you could imagine maybe like 2 sports fields. There can be up to 16,000 tree species in the Amazon. And that is more types of trees in just that small area than are found in all of North America combined. So many people live in the Amazon as well. It's not just plants and wildlife. The Amazon is home to more than 35 million people, which is about the population of Canada. And at least 1 million of these people come from indigenous groups like the one pictured here. And many of these groups still depend on the natural resources of the rainforest for food and for clothes, shelter, clean water, medicine. There are over 400 different indigenous groups with their own languages, cultural identities, ways that they manage and govern the land in which they live. And we actually started working in this region because of an alarm bell that was rung by this group here, which lives downstream of my field site. And they were experiencing dirty river water. Their water was full of sediment, and they worried that it was because of deforestation upstream. Okay, so this map shows you some of the deforestation that's been happening across the Amazon. So this shows you the top or northern half of South America. Now, in that raised area in the middle that looks a little bit brighter, that's the part of the Amazon that is in Brazil, which is where I do my research. The legend is written in Portuguese. That's the main language spoken in Brazil, but here's what it shows. So the green area is the area that remains covered in forest. You can see that this is quite a lot of the landscape still. The area that is yellow is the area that has been deforested, where the forest has been cut down. And the white areas are a different kind of ecosystem or biome than the rainforest. This area is called the Cerrado, which is a type of grassland. You might imagine the African savanna, that's a similar grassland. This one has more trees. You can see that the main area where the forest is being cut down is along the edge of the forest in sort of a curve. It's along the eastern and southern edge, and we call this the arc of deforestation. So you can also see a red dot that is labeled Tanguru. That's the name of my field site. The red dot is not just a dot, it's actually showing you the size of this one farm where I work. You can see it from space, it's very large. It's 800 square kilometers. That's about the size of New York City, including all 5 boroughs. Or in Canadian terms, that's about the size of 1 1/4 Torontos or 1 Calgary. So it's a very big single farm. So originally, most of the areas that were deforested in the Amazon were turned into pastures and used to raise cattle. Here's a picture of one of those pastures and one of those cattle. You can see that there is very little growing in this pasture. The grass is brown, the trees are bare. The rainforest isn't like the forests of North America where leaves come down in the fall and grow back in the spring. So this is unusual for plants in this area, but it is not actually very uncommon for pastures. So after the rainforest is cleared, healthy pastures only grow and support cattle for a few years before they dry up and become unhealthy. So this forces ranchers that are growing the cattle to abandon these pastures, clear more forest, and make new ones. This pattern of clearing forest, using a pasture until it is unproductive and then moving on is called slash and burn agriculture, sometimes called swidden agriculture. And it has been and continues to be the leading driver of deforestation in the Amazon. But actually there's an increasingly powerful drive to grow crops there as well. So the process of deforestation, if we return to our picture of the forest canopy, whether it's for pasture or for crops, involves cutting down pieces of the rainforest and making a landscape that looks like this from overhead to one that looks more like this. This is a photo from an airplane of the area close to my field site. You can see some forest, those dark green areas. some bare fields that are getting ready to be converted to crops. That's those sort of reddish areas. And then you can see these green areas that have sort of brown stripes. And that actually is recently deforested landscape. If you look closely, you can see tree trunks. They clear some of this land by linking a gigantic chain in between two tractors and driving through these forests, which pulls down those trees and plants. And then they bulldoze those plants into lines and they burn them. The alternative to this method is what we saw a lot this summer, where they light a patch of forest on fire and then deal with the sort of ash and remnants to clear an area. Now, right now, I can't see you guys or hear you, so you won't be able to answer this directly, but I want you to think about what you think happens to all of the animals that used to live in this forest when it was continuous. Once it's cleared, where do they go?
Shelby, if you'd like, I can actually demute some of the classes and have them answer that.
You know what? Yes, sure, that'd be great. Where do you think they go?
Okay, so let's go to Miss Winning's class. What do you guys think? Where do the animals go when they clear the forest like that? You can just yell it out if you want. Do it one at a time.
Shout it out.
Some of them will die.
Just die outright, okay?
Some of them will be taken to zoos, like she said.
Some might go to the farm.
Yeah.
Some go to different regions of the forest.
Yes, all of those answers are correct. Some of them might die directly. Some of them might try to find new patches of forest, and some will make use of the farm itself. So let's continue and take a look. So before I get into detail about the animals and show you some pictures of this wildlife, let's take a look at the landscape here for a second. So in this picture, you can see what a stream in the rainforest looks like. And this is one of the streams where I took lots of water samples to figure out how a rainforest stream works. And I want to draw your attention to a few things. First, you can see that it's very shady. So this is a bright sunny day, but here it's almost dark. And second, the water here is very clear. So it isn't too deep, but you can see directly to the bottom, and you can see the details of the sticks and the leaves and the sand. So this is a rainforest, so it's very hot and humid. And take a look at this picture and just imagine what it might feel like to stand here for a moment. And then imagine what it would feel like to stand here. You might open up to another class, Jesse. Do you think it would be hotter or colder than standing inside the forest?
Let's get Miss Gray's class going. What do you guys think? Hotter or colder than in the forest?
Hotter.
Hotter. Everyone says
Totally,
hotter.
totally. And one more question. Do you think it would be drier or wetter?
You are
Drier.
Drier? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I can imagine what it feels like to be in this photo too, because I took the photo, and you're absolutely right. It's hotter and it's drier. And so let's see why that's true. So this is actually a picture of the farm field growing soybeans during the wet season when it rains a lot. In this area, there's also a dry season when there's less than 2% of the annual rainfall. And during the dry season, so farmers don't have to water their crops here because they grow them just during the rainy season when it's wet and rain falls consistently. And in the dry season, the fields are bare and they look more like this. This is actually a video of what's called a dust devil. It's essentially a dust tornado. And you can see that it kind of goes across the farm field and then into the forest edge on the other side. And you can see that it looks much more like a desert or a really dry area than a tropical rainforest. And it's true that the more of a forest you cut down, the drier it gets. And this is one of the big risks for the Amazon as we continue to burn it and cut it down. So let's talk about how that works. So just like us, and as you know, if you've ever had to take care of a house plant or a Christmas tree, plants and trees need water. So plants take up water through their roots, but only a tiny fraction of the water they take up is actually used within the body of the plant. Most of it, more than 90% sometimes, is drawn up through the plant and is evaporated from holes in the plant's leaves, and it's returned to the atmosphere as water vapor. That process is called transpiration. And so trees, they work kind of like straws in the tropical rainforest. When it rains, these big buckets of rainfall shower water into the soil. The trees suck that water up and they evaporate it back to the atmosphere. And that process is incredibly important in a tropical forest like the Amazon. So more than a third of the rain that falls is recycled water that goes through these tree pumps. So without them, without this water vapor that's returned to the atmosphere, not as much rain is able to fall. And eventually it might be true that that forest would dry up altogether and not be able to maintain itself as a tropical rainforest anymore. So before I get into showing you some of the data for water at my field site, let me show you what we know about some of the animals in this area and where they have gone. So this is an animal called an American rhea. It is a large flightless bird, similar to an ostrich. It's a little bit smaller than an ostrich, but it's still quite tall. It's taller than me. I'm 5'4" or something, so you can imagine how big it is. And I saw this bird all the time at my field site. The first few times it was, well, actually every time it was incredible to see these beautiful birds, but it became very, very normal, almost like seeing a pigeon or a squirrel in most of our cities. So we saw dozens every day. They feed on the soybeans and they like the open fields. But in fact, they actually show us that these ecosystems are changing because they normally live in that savanna landscape that's found to the south of these forests. But as more of the forest has been cleared, they've moved north to take advantage of the soybean fields. Here's a mama rhea and some baby rheas. So all the female rheas live together when they're raising babies. And sometimes one or a couple of the females will babysit everybody. So this is a mama with lots of babies, not just her own, but pretty amazing, pretty cute. There are also armadillos all over the place. So they are burrowing into the soybean fields, into the roads. This is not a giant armadillo, but there are giant armadillos at my field site as well. I just never snapped a photo of one. Pretty cool. And their burrows become important for other animals as well, which you'll see in, oh, maybe I took that photo out of, there are burrowing owls, for example, that make use of their tunnels. I don't know if you guys recognize this animal, but this is a Brazilian tapir. So often tapirs are thought of as really secretive, shy animals, and it's pretty rare to see them when you're exploring the Amazon forest that's intact. But again, they're quite common here. They eat the soybeans. They come out from the forest edges and browse, and it was pretty common to see them. In fact, I was able to see a baby tapir as well. You can see that it's got some interesting markings on its side, sort of like a fawn, pretty cute. We've also seen tapirs swimming. So in this photo, I can't point to it, so I'm going to try to draw your attention to it, but there are some sticks sticking out of the water, but there's also a snout that looks a little bit like a snorkel. You can see its ears on either side of it, and that's a tapir sort of using its snout as a snorkel to swim from one part of a lake to another. And here it is, kind of just hanging out under the branches once it gets to the other side, taking a cooling bath. I also saw a swimming sloth in this area. Sloths are very slow, as you probably know, but they actually swim really fast. So that was pretty amazing, and it was so quick that I didn't get a photo of that one. So this is a giant anteater. To orient you, its nose is on the right side of the photo, and its tail is on the left. It's actually a threatened animal, so it's in danger of becoming extinct. It's really beautiful, and you can see that it's also making use of this soybean field for foraging. This is an animal called a red-footed tortoise. It's also threatened, and it actually has been collected as part of the pet industry, which is one of the big threats facing this turtle. But again, a really beautiful animal that makes use of these fields. Here's a blue and yellow macaw. These macaws fly through quite a bit. They usually fly through in pairs or in big groups. They're very loud. Here's a toucan, a toco toucan. We saw these pretty regularly too. And this strange animal is called a worm lizard or an amphisbaenid. And it's not a snake and it's not a worm, but it is a legless lizard. So in this case, its head is on the left-hand side, but you can see that it barely has any eyes. And that's because its eyes have been lost because it doesn't need to see. It burrows underground and spends most of its life in the soil. So the diversity of life in this area is amazing, astounding, and many of the species we haven't even identified yet. So there's lots still left to learn. So here, I want to show you a little bit more about what it's like to work in the field here. Here's a photo that shows you more or less how to dress for success if you are an ecologist in the Amazon. So we always carried machetes, not for fighting off dangerous animals, but for slicing through vines and branches that were blocking the way. So you'll notice that I have something on over my boots and lower legs, and these are called snake chaps. And they are what they sound like. So they're basically thick canvas tubes that we wear such that if a venomous snake attacks your legs, if you don't see it and it bites you, the fangs go through the fabric and not our skin. So thankfully, I never needed to see if they worked or not, but we did see many snakes, venomous and not. Once I was in the water with an anaconda, which was exciting, a little bit nerve-wracking. And before I show you some of our experimental setups and the work in the field, I want to return for a minute about this question of what happens when you cut down trees. So we talked about transpiration and how much lower transpiration rates are when you cut down a forest and you take out those tree pumps and replace it with soybeans or nothing. Now, at first, the same amount of rain will fall in this area, but it won't be sucked up by all of those forest trees' roots and returned to the atmosphere. So this is a trickier question, but what would happen to the water instead? So it has to go somewhere. Some of it might stay in the soil, but over time, it's going to travel down. Does anyone have a guess for what will happen to all that rainfall that falls from the sky and doesn't get sucked up and returned to the atmosphere by the trees? This is a hard question.
Let me ask Miss Langer's class. It is a hard question, but let's see if you guys have a thought. So Miss Langer's group, what do you guys think? What happens to all the rain?
It gets dry.
It dries up. It just seeks into the ground, she thinks, and that dries.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that's right, that it dries out the sort of surface soil, but the water still exists. And it doesn't totally evaporate. And what happens is the water goes down through the soil and enters the groundwater and then gets pushed out into the streams. And so then it leaves the local ecosystem one way or another, but if it's not returned to the atmosphere, it leaves through streams and rivers. And so when we deforest, we often, and we expect to see these sort of big increases in the amount of water leaving through a stream, which can then further dry out that local ecosystem because it's sort of exporting all that water away. So here is the question. I'm going to show you some data for this question in a minute, but does more water flow through streams in farm fields than in forests? So this would inform whether or not we're seeing this drying pattern in this area. So I'll show you a little bit about how we set up an experiment to test for this. So here I am in one of those forest streams. I'm hammering in some sampling devices here. We kept water loggers in all these streams to see how much water was flowing through the stream at any one time. Then I collected lots of water samples, did some chemistry in the field to preserve them and make sure we could analyze what was in that water. We also used these super cool machines. They almost look like little droids or little R2-D2s or something. So you can program these machines to collect water samples automatically over a period of time. So here in that blue garbage can on the left-hand side, I've put a bunch of hoses and pumps, and then I'm programming the machines to suck up water every now and then and collect it from streams even when I'm not there. So this is what it looks like inside one of those little machines. There are these open bottles that get filled by the water that's sucked in through those hoses. And then afterward, I can come out to the field, cap those bottles and take them back to look at the samples. So we set these up in the field to start collecting water when it rained. And here's what one of these setups looked like. So you can see there's a little funnel that goes into a bottle. And inside that bottle, I put an electric sensor that once it got wet from rain would turn the machine on and it would start collecting samples. And so under that crate is a car battery that we used to power it. So when you're doing work in the Amazon, you got to get creative about how to power things and how to set up experiments in the field. You also have to get creative and patient in dealing with the animals that come to check your setups out. So here is a spider that made its home on one of my machines. Had I known at the time that it was one of the most venomous spiders on Earth, I think I might have been a little bit more nervous about it. This is the Brazilian wandering spider. And it was not sort of the only interesting and kind of creepy crawly animal we encountered. So here's a picture. This is a machete handle. And those are sweat bees. They don't sting, but they're little bees and they're attracted to human sweat, which is why they're coming and flying around this machete handle. They would also fly around our eyes and our faces and our skin. Again, they didn't sting, so you sort of had to just figure a way to be calm while they were flying around you. Now, if you're working in the rainforest, you always want to store your boots upside down, because you don't want anything to crawl into them during the night. So I always stored my boots upside down. One morning, I woke up, grabbed my boots to make sure they were extra clear. I smashed them on the wall to see what would pop out. Nothing popped out. So I put my feet inside, and one of my feet, it didn't feel quite right. It felt like it wasn't quite reaching the end of the shoe. So I pulled my foot back out very slowly, a little bit nervous about what might be in there. And I slammed the boot on the wall as hard as I could. And this is what popped out. So we saw lots of tarantulas throughout my field work. Some were very big. This one is probably maybe 7 inches across. It's like its leg span. It's quite big. And I did scream. I was alone, and admit I gave quite a big scream and ran around a little bit, but it didn't bite me and it was okay. And tarantulas, in fact, if they do bite you, it feels like a bad bee sting, but it's not deadly. It won't make you really sick. A few more kind of creepy crawlies. Here's a female spider with spiderlings on her back. All those little white dots are baby spiders that she's carrying around from place to place. Here is a pretty beautiful centipede, also one you wouldn't want crawling on you though, despite its pretty red and blue colors. And here's another really beautiful, this is a stink bug. You also probably don't want to be carrying it around, but blue and red, just really astounding rainforest colors. Okay, so let's return for a minute to those data we were talking about and this question of whether there's more water coming out of streams in farm fields than in forests. So I'm going to show you a graph. I'm going to walk you through it. So this graph on the x-axis, so on the horizontal axis, you can see time, you can see months. It's basically a year of data. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you can see the mean daily flow. So the average amount of water that comes out of these streams. Now the black dots are soybean streams, so streams in farm fields. The open circles are forest streams, streams draining forest. And you can see that it's true, we get much more water coming out of those soybean streams, those farm field streams, than out of the forested streams. And in fact, overall, we found that it was about 4 times the amount of water comes out of those streams in farm fields than in forest. So what does this mean? Does it matter that 4 times as much water is leaving the area through streams rather than being recycled by trees back to the atmosphere? The answer is yes. This means that the area will be drier and that the moisture upon which this ecosystem depends is being lost as the forest is being cut down. If this was just one field, it might not matter. But if it's field after field after field, the risk is that so much forest will be cleared that even the forested areas that remain will stop getting enough rain and will no longer be rainforest. So the risk is that we're drawing the forest from the outside in. And if we want to keep this unique and precious ecosystem around, we need to think really carefully and be better about clearing less of the forest. So this can seem pretty overwhelming. It's a big job to stop deforestation. And indeed, with the summer and the fires in the Amazon, we've seen how much this can matter and how much it's happening right now. But in the past, we've been able to bring down the rate of deforestation and the rate of clearing, for example, by refusing to buy crops that were produced on recently cleared land. We can discourage farmers from clearing new land, instead encourage them to use those unproductive pastures to raise crops, for example. This was really successful about a decade ago. So there are lots and lots of reasons that rainforests like the Amazon are important to save the habitat for animals like those that I showed you in this talk. But also increasingly, we know how important they are for maintaining our climate and the ecosystems we know and care about. So they play a critical role in maintaining water balance and climate. Here's one final photo from my field site of some of those rheas moving across a farm field that's also being harvested at the same time. You can see the big, bright, colorful trucks in the distance. And now before I close, I just want to say that it's not ever just me that is working in these areas. I work with lots of wonderful collaborators from Brazil, the US, Germany, Canada. So I would be remiss to not acknowledge all of their work too. So scientists always work in teams, and that's part of the fun and part of the process. Okay, and now I want to hear all of your questions.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Riskin. That was fantastic. And I wish that we could get the picture or video of all the kids when we saw the tarantula at the end of that story. The best moments in the history of doing this, so I very much appreciate that.
That's
all right. Shelby, if you want to come out of screen share too, so we come back to you, that would be fantastic. And then, yes, we'll dive in with questions. We've got 4 groups watching on YouTube as well, including Miss McCann's group in Brampton. So if you guys want to type in questions there, I'll happily pass them on. But let's start, and we'll start with Miss Langer's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, come on up.
Okay. Actually, we were talking about this, and we are doing this as our learning right now, our class. So we had a question. I'm just going to say it. What animals are most at risk because of the deforestation? That is what we're learning at right now, is about loss of habitat.
Great question.
That is a great question. There are many, many species that are critically endangered in the Amazon. And there are many more species throughout Brazil that are at great risk, especially from habitat fragmentation. I don't know which animal is most endangered in this moment, but I will give you one example. This is actually an example from the Atlantic forest, which is kind of the slightly drier forest along the coast of Brazil, where a ton of habitat has been cleared. They've lost something like 70% of their habitat. And in that forest, you have these amazing, I think I have a photo of one here, monkeys.
Looking for tamarins?
Exactly.
I can pull up one on my computer if you'd like. So while you're talking about them, I'll get one up and I can screen share and show people.
Sure. Okay. So these tamarins live in small family groups. And some time ago, maybe mid-90s, it was found that only a few, maybe 50 existed, and they were separated mostly into groups of less than 10 animals. And so basically all of the wild animals, or a great number of the wild animals, were taken into captivity and underwent captive breeding programs to bring those populations back up to numbers that could be successfully reintroduced. There we go. There's the golden lion tamarin. It's really a beautiful animal. And it's actually been they're still at risk, they're still endangered, but it's been a pretty big success story for conservation. They've brought their population back up and connected the habitats in a way that has been successful. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's one example of one of the many threatened animals there.
Absolutely, and it's a really hard question to answer which species is most affected by any particular deforestation happening. The case of the matter is that it's all species, and things that are unable to escape and move to new habitats, they're probably at most risk, but finding out what those specific animals are is a very tricky scientific question to answer, which again, people like you are doing all around the world. Great question, guys. All right, let's dive in with Mr. Fisher's class. You want to come up? Go for it.
Yeah, Caleb, go ahead.
Okay. Is the forest still on fire, and how are they gonna put it out?
Yeah.
That's a great question. So it was not, the forest is still being burned in patches, but it is not the whole forest that is on fire. So what happened this summer is that more fires were being lit than normal, but it wasn't a big, huge fire that was sort of taking over the area. And it's always true. It's sort of what you might call a chronic crisis, or sort of a continuous crisis, that these forests, the fires for deforestation happen every year. We just had more of them this year. Typically they burn themselves out. So often these fires are really low. They burn sort of through the understory of the forest, and they kind of burn themselves out without burning too much of the forest. It's more an issue of how do you encourage people to clear less forest? So we saw so many this summer because more people were lighting fires to clear landscapes. So our challenge is not necessarily putting the fires out when they start, but instead preventing them from happening in the first place.
Very cool. I'm really glad we got the context on that too. There's a lot of people that's missed in a lot of the news coverage. All right, Miss Gray's class, come on up, guys.
Come up and ask your question. What is the largest animal you have seen?
Great question. The largest animal. So the tapirs are actually really big. They're like bigger than a cow, probably, so quite large. Jaguars, I've seen a jaguar, and that is also really, really astoundingly big. A puma is also quite big. I've seen a couple of those. I think that's the biggest.
What about that anaconda? Can you give a sense for kids who might not know what an anaconda is, how big a snake that is?
Yeah, so anacondas can be enormous. So they can be like 30 feet or 10 meters long. The one I saw was not so big. It was more like 2.5 meters long maybe, but still an intimidating snake to be in the water with for sure.
Yeah, I've always loved the analogy that the biggest anacondas get to be about the thickness of a telephone pole. So if you go outside and like hug a telephone pole, that's how thick that snake can get, which is ridiculous. Very cool. All right, Mr. Douglas's class, if you guys have one, come on up.
Is there anywhere in South America where there's more sustainable farming, as in just not just clearing forests and then planting crops, but more like having a smaller field which has been surrounded by rainforest, and then like kind of more like a grid system, like a checkerboard, if you get what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I would love to talk about this question with you for a long time. So I'll say a few things. One, yes, some places do it better than other places. Two, agriculture to grow crops in this region is really hard. The soils are really unique, and you need tons of inputs like fertilizers and pesticides and other sort of farming inputs to make the crops grow well, which means big companies are the ones that can afford to do crop-based agriculture here. So smaller farmers are not necessarily profitable in this region, which incentivizes sort of big farms. And people have an active debate that I encourage you to check out and look up between whether it's better to do land sparing or land sharing. And by that, so land sparing would be you take a bigger farm and a smaller farm, and you just farm it really intensively and get your crop yields as high as they can possibly be. And then you leave as much forest around it intact as possible. And land sharing would be sort of what you're talking about, where you have lower scale agriculture, less intense, and more of like a mosaic of natural landscapes and agricultural landscapes. But in a place like the Amazon, where, as we heard of, the question a few questions ago got at this, where habitat connectivity is so important and intact forest is so important, it may be that it's actually better to do that really high scale intensive agriculture and save as much of the remaining rainforest as we can, rather than make this kind of lower intensity patchwork of agriculture. There are sort of costs and benefits both ways.
Great answer, and one that, as you sort of hinted at, you could go on for a long time. So what I'll do at the end of this is I can put you guys in touch and see if we can pass along a broader answer. So if you're interested in learning more or checking out some of the resources online, you can do that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, let's go to Miss Winning's class. Come on up, guys. Hey.
Hi.
Hi.
What is the dangerous or aggressive animal you have come across?
Oh, good question. The animal that I was most scared of, because it's sort of the most venomous, is a snake called the bushmaster. It is smaller than an anaconda, but bigger than any of the sort of like rattlesnakes or venomous snakes we have in North America. You can look it up if you want to. It's a pretty scary snake. And we found a few dead bushmasters in the field while we were out. And there were a few people who were catching snakes at my field site who worked on reptiles, which I do not. And they did catch a live one at night and brought it back to the field site. So I was able to see it, but it was in a controlled way where I wasn't at risk from it. So venomous snakes definitely were what I was most worried about. And the bushmaster was sort of the most lethal one, or the one I thought about most often.
Very cool. All right. I'm going to take a question from a class on YouTube, and then we'll do another round of questions with all the live groups. So Dahlia, in Miss McCann's class, wanted to ask when you started working in the Amazon and how you got interested in fieldwork.
Great question. So I started working in the Amazon right after I graduated from undergraduate work. So after I graduated from university. And I just volunteered to work on a project that needed help carrying water samples at a field site. And so I took advantage of it. They paid for my plane ticket, and that was basically it. And so it was hard work and a sort of scary slog, but I loved it. It was so amazing to be in this part of the world where I would never have otherwise been able to go. And so I sort of caught the bug then, and then a few years later went to do graduate work with that same lab.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of the stories of the people we bring in as speakers start with, there's this opportunity, we got a plane ticket, I was the most lowly level thing. So especially for our grade 11, 12 students that are in on this, like if you guys are keen on something, ask, go to the lab, go talk to them. You guys are really close to U of T, which has so many amazing resources. So that's a good thing to check out, and thanks so much for that, Shelby.
Yeah.
All right. Miss Langer's class, if you guys want to come back up, go for it.
And Jesse, we are going to do this question, and then we have to visit another class that wants to share their learning. So we will say goodbye after this question.
Perfect.
But thank you so much, Dr. Riskin, for amazing learning today.
Oh, thanks for coming.
Elizabeth. Okay, Elizabeth, up here.
Since you said that rainforests are sort of like air conditioners, since they're all drying, will the oxygen still go around the world so everybody will get at least some oxygen?
That's a great question. So it's a complicated answer. I'll do my best. You can keep asking questions if what I say doesn't make sense. So yeah, so we often think about the rainforest as being, or people talk about it as the lungs of the world because it gives off oxygen from the trees, takes up carbon dioxide. But the truth is that just like your body and my body, trees also use oxygen. So just like they give it off, they also consume it. So the oxygen in our atmosphere is there not so much because of the action of trees and more because of the sort of historic and long-term millions of year action of plants and trees and biota on Earth. But the way it works as an air conditioner is sort of twofold. One is this waterway that we've been talking about. And yes, as you cut down trees, we kind of risk that we'll dry out and sort of heat up the local area of the Amazon, which would reduce its ability to cool that region. And then two, it stores carbon. And so in the trees themselves and in the soil, there's tons of carbon stored. And when those trees get cut down and they get burned, all of the carbon that's tied up into the trees gets released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And if you thought about climate change or global warming in your class at all, you know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so it traps heat and it makes our planet warm up. So if you clear forest and burn it, more carbon is going to be released to the atmosphere, and that pattern of climate change and global warming is going to increase. And so in that way, it sort of keeps our planet cool by keeping all of that carbon out of the atmosphere and in the trees and soils.
Excellent answer. All right. You know what? On the air conditioning note, I actually want to pass along the quickest YouTube question ever from you, Raj, in Ms. McCann's class, which is how hot does it get in the dry season, Shelby, where you were?
Yeah, it's super hot. So it's in the 30s in Celsius, in the 90s in Fahrenheit, and it's super dry. So you can hang a wet t-shirt out to dry on a clothesline and it's dry in a couple of hours, which is amazing because in the wet season, it's over 90% humidity and that shirt might not dry for weeks. So it is an intensely different experience to be there in the dry and wet season.
Very cool. All right. Let's go to Mr. Fisher's class again. Come on up, guys.
Hello. I have 2 questions.
Go for it.
Okay. So my first question is, how does deforestation affect tribes in the forest?
That's a great question. So overall, of course, it sort of encroaches upon the land that they think of as their own, and that is their own. That said, the tribes and sort of the control of indigenous groups over landscape is different in Brazil and in the Amazon region than it is in, for example, North America. So they have much stronger governance over their own landscapes. And so there's very little deforestation in the areas that they live and control. And they actually fully control them as sort of their own government rather than the government telling them how to control that landscape.
Yeah, awesome, guys. And then let's go back to that class. So ask your second question. Go right ahead.
Will deforestation lower population of clouds, and will this decrease the amount of rainfall?
Good question.
Yes. So that's exactly the risk. So clouds, of course, are made out of water vapor. So that's where that returned water vapor from those trees goes. It becomes clouds that then rain again. And so scientists don't know what the threshold is for cutting down so much of the rainforest that, you know, it stops being able to make enough rain to maintain the rainforest. They think it's maybe something between 30 and 40% of the rainforest, which we have not reached yet.
Neat question. All right, I'm gonna go to Mr. Douglas's class first and then go to Gray and Winning. So let's go to Mr. Douglas's group. Come on up, guys.
So you were talking about soybean fields. So I was curious if this was feed for animals or if it was making vegetarian products, and how sustainable this vegetarian products were if they were cutting down rainforests.
Yes, fantastic question. Almost all of this soy is animal feed, and it's being sent mostly to China as chicken feed. So the increasing demand for meat in other parts of the world outside of North America is what's mostly driven this increase in soybean production. That said, in the early 2000s, a lot of the soybeans were being used by the European Union, not to make tofu and vegetarian products, but as filler in, for example, McDonald's hamburgers, which aren't entirely made of beef. And there actually were really successful campaigns sort of linking your McDonald's hamburger to rainforest deforestation that pushed the European Union to make some of the most strict rules about buying products from deforested land that were really effective. But no, it's not going into sort of like the tofu and soy milk that you might buy.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Miss Gray's class, come on up, guys.
Hi, hey, we actually have to go because our bell just rang.
Cool. Do you have a quick question before you go? Anything you want to ask? Or run away?
I think they want to get, we gotta get, okay, go ahead, Brayden.
How much does it cost to cut down the trees?
Great question, and a question that I can't answer very well for you. It's probably very cheap to burn, expensive to drive tractors through.
Yeah. Okay, great question. And bye, guys. Thanks so much for joining in. Okay, on that note, we've had a few classes have to go. One last question. Let's go to Miss Winning's class. End us off, guys. Yay.
Can the areas that were used for farming and can't be used anymore to replant on by projects like Team Trees?
So can we replant on those areas? They've been cut down, used for farming. We can't farm on them anymore. Can they be replanted?
That's a fantastic question. The answer is slightly complicated in that it's very hard. It's very hard to get a rainforest to regrow. That said, it's not impossible. And there have been some successful sort of secondary growth forests that seem to function a little bit differently than primary forest. And people are still working on ways to get plants to grow. Because if you can imagine, if you're a very thirsty rainforest tree and you're now trying to grow in the middle of a very sunny field, it's tricky. You have to somehow shade them, protect them, give them more water to regrow and reestablish.
Yeah, but yes, in the long run, which is a good sign because we're going to need that sort of thing going forward.
Yes.
Dr. Riskin, this has been fantastic. Is there any last message you want to share with classes about how they can learn more about the Amazon, learn more about your work, anywhere we can guide them for extra stuff after the session?
Great question. I meant to give this more attention than as you asked me before. So Woods Hole Research Center is a fantastic group that does research on the Amazon, and they also do a great deal of public outreach. So you can find a lot of interviews with scientists from that research center, and I highly recommend reaching out or looking up Woods Hole Research Center and listening to what those scientists have to say. There are also, of course, so many wonderful books about Amazon biodiversity. Any sort of, picture book of animals and plants from the Amazon is a great resource to start getting an idea of just how many species of plants, animals, fungi, etc. Live in that region. There's a really fun Dr. Seuss book called If I Ran the Rainforest that I also recommend with some of the same information that I talked about today.
Very cool. And for some of our older kids too, I'd really recommend Planet Earth 2 as a jungles episode. So not solely on the Amazon, but on jungles around the world. And if you want to learn and see and sort of dive in a way that nothing else can, that's the best way to do it. So I'll pass along all those resources, especially Woods Hole, to all our classes when we're done. Dr. Riskin, as you know, when we finish one of these sessions, what we always do is I'm going to demute everyone's microphone. So for our remaining classes, if you guys could join me in saying a huge thank you to Shelby for joining us today. No. Everyone is now demuted. Go for it. Thank you guys so much. Awesome. For all our classes, thanks so much for joining today. We loved having you. And Shelby, thanks so much again.
Oh, total pleasure. Thank you everyone for coming, and please don't hesitate to reach out.